This week's video is all about the implicit and explicit grid. Now, what is the implicit and explicit grid? Well, we can define exactly what our grid is, but say you make a container and you tell it that it's a grid and you put a bunch of stuff in there. It's going to make rows automatically. It's going to place those things on the grid, even though you haven't told it how to treat those rows yet. And we can also tell it that don't place them on rows. You can have it automatically create columns instead. And sometimes you'll have a grid that you've defined, but then you're adding more stuff to it, and those things are falling into the automatically created parts of the grid. So the explicit grid are the parts that we've defined, whereas the implicit parts are the automatically created ones. And we can control all of this. So this video is all about taking a look at how the whole implicit and explicit grid even works, and then also how we can control it to take advantage of it, because it's a little bit weird and it can be confusing sometimes when things aren't going where you think they are and all of that. But you can definitely leverage the auto thing, and you can control these auto columns and auto rows really easily actually, and you can make it so you have a lot less markup in the long run. So it's really cool for that. And we won't be doing a really cool looking site for this, just because I thought it'd be easier with a sort of a theoretical example instead, to really nail down exactly how this is happening, and well, let's go take a look.
Alright guys, so here we are in CodePen once again, so as usual the link is down in the description below. Right now I haven't done very much. I've just set up an H1 and a little paragraph there. I have a div grid container, and in there I have 9 boxes. The first one has a different color on it because we're going to play around with that one a little bit later, so that just has its own background color. And these have their color, and they all have a bit of padding on them, and otherwise there's nothing much going on with this at all. So what we want to be doing is, well, I have my grid container here, so we will, as usual, start off by doing, whoops, not a grid, we have to say display grid. And, well, nothing changed. We have a grid, and it's there, but it's not doing anything yet. So let's go take a look at it. I'm going to use my inspect element, and I am in Firefox for this. Chrome doesn't offer this. So I'm going to go on the grid container, and you can see it is a grid, and I'm going to turn on my grid so we can get some lines on there that we can see. Now I'm not going to be using my inspect element very much, but I do need to leave it open for this to work. So I'm just going to hide it down until I'm not used to, there it is. I'm not used to Firefox. The colors are all too similar for me. So very, very subtle, but we can see some lines on there. So the first thing I'm going to do, just to help make it a bit easier to see things, is I'm also going to do a grid gap on this. So grid gap, and let's just do 2M to make a nice big gap. So now we can really, let's do 1.5, maybe that's a little too big. But I just want to make it super easy to be able to see our grid. So when I do a display grid, it's making a grid, but I haven't told it what to do yet. So it makes a grid and it hasn't done pretty much anything yet. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I am going to come here and say grid template columns. So we're going to make some columns. So just so we understand, make sure you all understand, if I do 300, it's going to make one column, 300 pixels, and it's automatically making a bunch of rows right now. Now I haven't told it to make any rows, but just automatically it's decided to make some rows to fill that space. If you don't want it to automatically create rows, you can also tell it to automatically create columns instead. So that's one of the things you can do with the grid auto flow. The default on that is row, and I can change that to column. Oops, like so. So now instead of making rows, it's making columns, and those columns are going across that way. So it does give me some horizontal scrolling, because it's not automatically making rows, it's automatically making columns. So it's just going along, and it will keep making more columns as long as it needs to. Now one thing you'll also notice is this first column is bigger than all the other ones. And this is where we get into the explicit and implicit grid. The only column I've explicitly stated is this one here. I've told it there's one column of 300 pixels. So we have 300 pixels. And I haven't told it what else to do. So it doesn't know what to do, so it just puts it as small as possible. So if I go and look at those, they're all as small as possible. The only thing controlling that size is the padding here. If I made the padding smaller, they're going to get smaller. Make the padding back bigger, and they get bigger. So it's just the content that's inside of them that is dictating the size of them. And that's the same thing if I turn this off, or if I switch this, again, the default on that is row. So that goes back to the default behavior where they're going one on top of each other. So in case of all of these, the height of each one of these rows is being just automatically decided by the height of the content inside of it. So if we go and look, we see grid template row, and let's go with 300 pixels too, so we get a square. Rows, not row. So this first one here is 300 by 300, and all these other ones are just fitting the content because I've only told it to have one row of 300 pixels. So I've explicitly stated this column in this row. This is defined by me. All of this other stuff is automatically created. And when it's automatically creating things, that's what we call the implicit grid. I'm going to get more detail and see some of the other things that happen with this as this video goes on. So hopefully, if you're a little bit confused right now, hopefully it starts to make a bit more sense. Now, I think it's going to help illustrate my point a little more if we're not using one column and one row. So for now, I'm going to turn off my template rows. And we can get rid of this because that is the default. And let's switch this over. I'm going to make 4 columns. So I could do 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. I want them all the same size. So I could do something like that. Now I could do this exact same thing instead just by repeating it. So repeat 4, 1 FR. So it's repeating that 4 times. And I get my 4 columns. So these first 4 columns are part of my explicit grid. I've explicitly stated there should be 4 columns, but it's implying that there should be multiple rows because my content can't fit in that space. So it has to invent the space for these to exist on. To help illustrate this even more is the autofill and the autofit. So when I do my repeat here, I can actually change this to autofill and autofit. Now to really illustrate this point, I'm actually going to give ourselves only 2 boxes. I will have to do my inspect element again on there now. So you can see right now, I've told it that we should have 4 columns of 1 FR. So 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. They're 1 FR each, and it's explicitly stated. So it knows that it should have that. So, you know, in 1 FR, it's splitting the screen up into 4 bits. So let's just say I made this 200 pixels. Each one of those boxes is 200 pixels. So there's my defined grid. You'll also notice right now, if I do my grid template row, 1 FR, rows, Firefox shows you the implicit and explicit grid. So right now you can see, if you can tell if your screen's big enough, I have a nice solid border going all the way around there. If I take off my grid template rows, this turns into a dotted line. So the dotted line means it's the implicit grid. So it's just making a row here for this content to fit on. So my grid template columns, so I have 4, but what if I don't need 4? Well, I could do repeat, and there's 2 options. There's autofill. And autofill is going to take the size of my grid. It's going to see that I want each column to be 200 pixels, and it's going to make as many rows as can fit in that space. So it's filling the space with columns. So you can see as I'm doing this, they're disappearing, and even now they'll stack because I don't have room for 2 to go next to each other. This could be super useful for not needing some breakpoints on fixing designs. So you can see that as I'm doing that, it's creating more and more rows automatically, which is pretty cool. There's autofit and there's autofill, and there's also autofit. Now the difference with autofit is it's going to take my 2, but it's not going to create any more. It's just repeating for whatever is in there. So if I add a new box in here, copy, paste. Let's put that as a 3. You can see now I have 3. Of course, I have to pull up my inspector again because I'm changing the markup. There you go. So now it's automatically fitting. So the auto fit means fit how much content I have, whereas the autofill means fill the container, or take this container and put as many columns in there even if they're not being used. It's just a very small and very subtle difference. So it's a really subtle difference between the 2 of them, but there is a difference there, and I do think it is important to know about that difference. Another thing, okay, so we have this. Let's go and bring back my 9 boxes now. And if you, 9, so 3, 6, 9, fix. Okay, great. So now that I'm back to my 9 boxes, we can get rid of this, I think. Let's go back to repeat for 1FR because that's going to work well for what we want to do. I mentioned that the autofill before when we started with this will keep making new rows or new columns. And as we can see here, so before I did that, so we did grid auto flow, and when I change that to column, it just makes a whole ton of columns, and it's gonna like spill out that way because I haven't stated that I want any rows. So my grid doesn't have any rows in it, so it's gonna say, okay, well, I'm not automatically creating rows anymore, I'm only automatically creating columns. So this is where it's implying that there'll be a lot of columns, but it's not going to implicitly create any rows. But if I have existing rows, so if I do grid template rows, and let's say I have repeat 1FR, what it's doing now is I've told it has to have 2 rows. So no matter what happens, you're going to have 2 rows, but it's changing the flow of things. So it's making everything go in columns instead of making things go in rows. So you can see I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 9 is stuck over there. If I put this back to row, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 that way instead. So that is important to know. Oh, and yeah, sorry, I was going, why is this one smaller? And it's because it can fit that one in. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So when I get to 8 here, I've used up all of my rows. We have 1, 2, then, okay, we're not starting a new row, so we're going to start a new column. 3, 4, okay, we have to start a new column. 5, 6, okay, we got to start a new column. 7, 8, start a new column. But this column, I haven't explicitly said what it is. So that's why this one is smaller than the rest. And even if I make, no matter what I do, these ones are growing and shrinking a little bit because they're 1FR. And this is just as small as it could possibly be because we haven't told it how big that should be. So that is important to know. And if I switch this over to 3, well, now all the content can actually fit here. And we have an extra empty one on the side because I don't have enough content to fill up that space. So, and again, if I do row, it's going to put everything across and then loop down that way. And if I switch it to column, it fills my columns up instead of filling the rows first. So understanding how the auto flow works is really important. You can do some cool stuff with your layouts with that. Okay, next, let's do a 3 and a 3, just so we have a nice even layout. Now, a few more things with how the implicit and grid, the implicit and explicit grid work. So I have my box 1, and we can tell this box where to go. So if I do grid column, so we can tell number 1 here not to start on the first line, but to start on the second line. So grid column 2. And it's going to push over, and it pushes everything over with it. I could say start on line 3, and it's going to push over to line 3. Because I have line 1, line 2, and line 3. So it's starting at line 3 and it's using that space. Or I could say go from 2 to 4. So start on line 2 and end on line 4. Now what happens if I tell it to end on a line that I've never created? Such as line number 6. I don't have 6, but it creates 6. The grid will adapt to what you're doing. So if you tell it to put 6, it's not going to go, nope, there's no 6th line, this doesn't work. It's going to create extra ones. So you can see here, it's creating some extra. So I have my explicit grid, and if you can see on your screen, there is a darker line here, like a solid line there. And then over here, this line here is a dotted line, because this area over here, well, the bottom line is still solid because that's part of the row that's existing. But this whole area over here, these 2 columns are being implied by me telling it that it should go that far. And I could even tell it you're actually starting on the 6th line. Start over on 6. So it's going to go all the way to 6, even though I didn't tell it there's 6. I only explicitly told it that there's 3 columns. It's going to move all the way over to the 6th column because I'm telling it there should be 6. So it's kind of weird, and you might get unexpected results because of this sometimes. And one thing that's really important, let's make this one a little bit smaller. Let's just do line 4. We can control these autos that it's making. So it's really important to know that you can control the auto things that it's making. So back on the parent, I can do grid auto columns. And I can also do the same with grid auto rows. And so you can tell it that the ones that are automatically being created, how big are they? So if I did 1FR, well, now they're all the same because my columns are all 1FR, and now my auto columns are that as well. Or I could say this is actually 2, and it's going to get bigger than the rest of them. So I could do, let's say I do a 4/6. So these, I have 2 columns now that are being created. I haven't outlined them. These are being created by the browser because I'm telling it that there should be 6 columns. So it's going, okay, well, I need 2 extra columns, and those auto columns, I'm going to be putting them as 2FR. Or you can obviously give this a pixel value. So I do 10 pixels, they're going to be nice and tiny. We'll stick with 100 now, just for this demo right here. But you can see these things are also flowing into these auto ones that are being created. So it's implying that the grid is there, so then everything is going to use the grid. It's not only this special thing that I'm telling it to pull out of the grid. Cool. So I hope that's nice and clear that we can do that. So what I'm doing now is I'm saying there's only 2 real rows. There's 2 rows here, but because my content needs more space, it's creating a 3rd row to put this stuff on. So I can do the exact same thing. I can have my grid auto rows and say 100 pixels, and you can see that one just changed a little bit. Let's just make that like 300 so it's a bit more clear to get bigger. So this is an automatically created row, so it's just going to grow in size. Now this can be really, really useful because if you have something that you just want it to be equally spaced out, you don't even have to give any template rows. You could just say all my rows are going to be automatically created as my content fills in them, and they're all going to be equal in height, so I'm putting them all at 1FR. Or they're all going to be, I don't know, 10 ems tall. And you can explicitly say that, or you can say that all my grids are just automatically created, so as I add more content, it's just going to keep adding more and more rows by itself, and all of those rows will automatically be the same height. So that is something cool that you can do with that. So for now, I'm actually going to bring this back up to here, and we're going to delete that. Cool. So we're getting there, guys. We're getting there. And just to show you, actually, we can do this grid row. Say I do 10, it's going to shoot down and make a whole bunch of empty ones. So here, I got a whole ton of empty ones. There's no content inside of these. So these 3 here, 1, 2, 3, are being defined by my repeat 3 1FR. So they're all the same height, even though these ones are empty, because I'm telling that this 3rd row has to have a height of 1FR. These ones don't have a height on them, so they're collapsing down to 0, and then, but this is where I get, just to reiterate, I can use my grid auto rows and say it's, I don't know, 10 pixels. And now they're 10 pixels tall each. Now 10 pixels is a bit weird. Maybe we do 150 pixels. I don't know why we'd do even that, but now all of these automatically created rows, they're all empty because there's nothing on them, but they're all the same height. And then I finally get down to my 10th row down here where this number 1 is living. So just to show that you can do it the same with your rows and with your columns. Now let's put this back to 3. Let's get them living in the 3rd one. So we're back to our original grid, sort of. But you'll notice I have this empty space. So with the autoflow here, we can actually tell it to fill in these empty spaces that happen. Just as a quick thing that I'm going to put this actually to a grid row of 3 as well. And now it's going to fill in that empty space. Because, let's just backspace that. This is going to push over and then push over. So this is falling down to the next line. But as soon as I pull this off, so I'm telling it like come from here and go down to this empty space here, it's going to go down to that empty space. And that means, it's not going to push everything into all these implied things. It just sort of fills. We deleted that whole empty one on the top, and this is just falling down to the bottom. So that's cool. But say you don't want to bother with that. You want this on the 3rd row, but you don't want these empty. And it sort of would suck to have to take this and tell it you have to live here, and to take this and to say you have to live here. So on here, on my grid auto flow, I can say row dense. And it just means if there's an empty space, fill that up if you can fit. So row dense, you can also have column dense. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, my 1, because that's where I told it to be. 8, 9. So column dense will do it that way, row dense will go across, or you can of course just write dense by itself. The default on the grid autoflow is row, so if you just write dense, it's the same as writing row dense, and it will just fill in those empty spaces. So if I take this 1 here and I actually tell it that my grid row is a span 2, I don't have to worry about and maybe you're on 2. I don't have to worry about these weird empty spaces that could come up. So you can see I get my empty space there again. I don't want that to happen, so something like this for your layout, or let's say 2 over span 2, you want to move it down. You can control one element on your grid, but have everything else fill into those empty spots that are around it. So the grid autoflow dense can be super, super handy. I'm also a little bit surprised it's not the default behavior, but maybe that's just me. That's sort of how I expected it to work when I first started playing with it, to be honest.
So there you have it. I hope the implicit and explicit grid makes a little bit more sense. I hope you liked this video. And of course, if you did like it, hit the thumbs up so I do know you liked it. If you haven't yet subscribed, I bring you a new video like this every single Wednesday, so consider subscribing. And of course, until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.